So we are here with Kim Vanyas from the Big and Small Tortoise Rescue and Sanctuary. And we're gonna do a quick interview and tour of the facility. So to start off, why did you choose the name Big and Small Tortoise Rescue and Sanctuary?
Yeah, good question. And I almost sometimes wish I hadn't made the name so long because it is hard for people to say. But the reason I did is because initially when I was starting or wanted to start a rescue, there was a couple rescues around that restricted just to taking in small tortoises because the big ones take up so much resources and space, and so they had like their one big sulcata and that's all they could handle and that's all they could take in. So my goal was to take in any big tortoises that need help, anything that needed help basically. So my name was Big and Small Tortoise Rescue and Sanctuary, not just for the small ones. But ironically, I'm kind of realizing why rescues get into that bind because they do take up so many resources and space. So I'm also struggling with that, but we're doing what we can and expanding where we can. We went from home base to this great facility where we have a greenhouse available and much more land. So we're starting to expand. I think we'll get our next big one in here soon. And when we can't take them in here, we try to send the big ones down south so they can have a home that is a bit more climate friendly.
So with that, how long have you been in operation?
So we started officially as a nonprofit in 2017. So the organization itself has been around for about 5 years, but we have been dabbling in rescuing tortoises for many more years prior to that. So,
Okay.
yeah.
And then what is the variety of tortoises that you have here?
So we have redfoots, sulcatas, Russians, leopards, hingeback, box turtle, elongated Greeks, desert, and I think that's it. So 9 species right now.
Why did you specify turtles and tortoises in particular? Like, why was that your niche?
Good question. So back before we were a rescue, there was just a redfoot on for adoption from a local humane society in somewhere in Minnesota. And I just saw this one online and said, hey, that would be a really unique pet, and decided to give it a try. In fact, I heard from like my sister who used to do, animal rehab. She's now a veterinarian, but and she used to talk about this tortoise who would follow her around, and it just sounded like a really cool pet. And so I gave it a try and adopted this redfoot. And when I adopted it, it was a courtesy post, so I adopted it directly from the owner. And the owner was talking about how she was basically trying to teach me how to take care of this thing. She said she fed it strictly spinach and chicken. That's it. Later learned, spinach is kind of a no-no. You're not supposed to feed spinach. So just learned, and she also gave us the setup, and the setup was really, really bad. Just a small tub. He could hardly turn around. So I just kind of learned how miserable this poor redfoot had really been living. And so I tried to turn his life around, give him a good life, and that I found to be really rewarding. And so later found another one in need of a home on Craigslist, even worse health conditions. So I just started looking around and realizing how many were actually in need, and decided, obviously, it's in my heart to rescue these guys, and so might as well make this an official organization, gain some credibility, potentially, get some grants and make this actual resource for people to come to, and grow it into something worthwhile. So that's kind of how it all started.
How many individuals do you have at the sanctuary right now?
So we have on site, it ranges by anywhere from 30 to 50 tortoises. We're closer to 50 right now.
Okay, and then we talked a little bit about climate a little bit earlier, but what does the range in climate entail for care on your?
Yeah, so there's only so much controlling the climate when they're kept outdoors. So outdoors, obviously they all go through the same temperature ranges, but sometimes it's a little chillier of a day or it's a rainy day, and so those particular animals or species that don't handle cool, damp weather very well will stay inside in the greenhouse. So for example, Russians or leopards who are really susceptible to respiratory infections, they'll stay the day in the greenhouse. So it's really nice to have that option. So that's kind of what it looks like for summer. And then in winter, we are even more restricted. We're indoors, all same climate in here. We can keep them in open boxes, and really we could try to tent off the redfoots and make their area a little more humid or things like that. But at the end of the day, my goal is to give them as much space as possible, and it gets a little difficult when you have so many in their own pens, and trying to control the climate in such a small space is also very, very difficult. And so I try to keep it as simple as possible, with the goal of giving them enough space. So for winter time, for these more humid liking species like redfoots, we try to just make sure to give them baths and spray them down every day. Just try to supplement their humidity levels.
Gotcha. And then what is the variance in food look like for that?
Yeah, so we have a lot of different species. So we have some that are herbivores and some that are omnivores. So we keep a wide range of different food on hand. But in summertime, we try to make all of them graze on natural vegetation, whether that be grasses or weeds. I'll try to supplement with the purchased greens, but definitely try to get them to eat the natural, to graze as much as possible. Omnivores will supplement with also fruits and different veggies and protein. In winter, the more grass eaters will get hay, some pellets, and then omnivores will kind of continue to get the same thing, but maybe a little more greens mixed in because they're not grazing as much as they usually do.
In terms of how long an animal is here, are there any residents that have been around for a super long time that are in one way or another sort of like a mascot, but more like a long-term part of the sanctuary?
Yeah, so there's the sulcata that I talked about that we rescued that kind of inspired this whole thing, who had really bad metabolic bone disease. He's kind of my favorite just because, near and dear to my heart, personal pet that I rescued. That's always very rewarding when you have a story behind it like that. So he means a lot to me, but I wouldn't say he's like a mascot of this place. And that's because, we really emphasize the sanctuary part of what we do, and it's a place for people who can't take care of their tortoises anymore, but they've had it for so long and it means a lot to them, but they're at a point in their life where they can't take care of them anymore. So we're a place where they can come and we take care of the tortoise, but they get to keep in contact with them as much as possible. So we try to put the spotlight on those tortoises so people can keep in touch and not put the spotlight on my personal tortoises, because I get to see them every day. So that's why we don't really technically have a mascot. But I would say if we did have a mascot, it would definitely be that sulcata that inspired everything. His name's Dozer.
Do you have any turtles or tortoises in the media that you're a super big fan of, like maybe the Ninja Turtles or Crush from Nemo that you're very partial to?
Yeah, so I don't keep in touch with, or keep tabs on all the fictional characters of turtles and tortoises, but all these famous tortoises that you hear about that live like a really, really long time, those always fascinate me. Like Jonathan is the really old Galapagos tortoise. I think his age is like 190 or something right now. So yeah, these are the ones that always catch my eye, I guess.
Gotcha. And you talked a little bit about how you believe that smaller tortoises, combined two words there. Smaller tortoises still have the capacity to live long lives. Do you want to elaborate on that a little bit? You described it to us earlier, and I think that's super valuable.
Yeah, so sometimes when you look online, you'll see that the smaller tortoise's life expectancy is somewhere like 40 to 60 years old. But I really do believe that any tortoise has the capacity to live 100 plus years old, and not just the big ones, like Jonathan, because these bigger ones are very influential to the media, and zoos always had the bigger ones, so you'll have a full history or like documentation of the bigger ones, but no one really has taken good notes on the smaller ones. But there is one famous case, or one famous tortoise named Timothy in the UK. So he was, technically it ended up being a female, but they named him Timothy, not knowing what gender he was at first. So she ended up living 140 years old, recently passed away unfortunately, but so that's a good example of even the smaller species living that long. So if you care for them right, they are also capable of living that long.
Speaking of care, is there what sort of cases do you see coming in more often than others, based on care? Like, is metabolic bone disease a huge one, or what's super common to see coming?
Yeah, so we'll see a variety of cases because, like I said, we also do the sanctuary, and the sanctuary is often people who care a lot. And we've even had people who bring in tortoises who are 60 plus years old. So obviously they know what they're doing, they took care of them very well. So those cases, I'm almost learning from them. How did you keep them alive for this long? I'm gonna do exactly what you're doing. So that was an example with the desert tortoises, where this person kept them in their basement for hibernating over the winter. And although I'm not a super fan of hibernating tortoises, I just did exactly what they've been doing because it's obviously working so well. So, sanctuary is a little different. But ones that come into the rescue and are surrendered from maybe people who didn't put in the effort to really learn how to take care of them correctly, on many times the biggest mistakes I see are people who are keeping them in aquariums, so very small space, and when you put a heat source over an aquarium, whole thing gets very hot, so hot and dry. So it's really important with keeping tortoises to have kind of a temperature gradient. These are cold-blooded animals, so they need to have the option to kind of choose where they're comfortable sitting. So that is one biggest mistake I see. Second is lighting, and this is not really to blame on the owner because lighting can be very confusing. There's so many bulbs on the market, and it's hard to know which one is the best one. So lighting, not having the right UV exposure, UVB. But one thing is you don't really need to be a super experienced in the lighting. Biggest thing is keep them outside because the sun is the best source of UVB, and they could, honestly, I wouldn't recommend this, but they could probably survive an entire winter indoors without lighting as long as they get back outside and replenish their UVB exposure in the summer. And frankly, with the bulbs that some people choose, that's exactly what they're doing. They just don't know it. So they live outside. Some tortoises, I'm like, how did they even survive this long? Because they kept them outside in the summer. There's some people using incandescent bulbs, and I just cannot believe it. But like I said, if they happen to be wise enough to keep them outside in the summer, that's what replenished the UVB and the vitamin D in their systems and kept them going, kept them healthy. Yeah.
What has been the largest learning curve in your experience taking care of these animals?
The biggest learning curve. I would say probably more on the medical side, because even veterinarians, finding veterinarians that are experienced in this is really tricky. Thankfully, we have a really good veterinarian. We go to Oaks Veterinary Clinic in Des Moines with Dr. Miner and Dr. Harmon. They're really open to, well, first, they have a lot of tortoise experience. They do. But there's just not many studies on them. So they themselves are limited on what medications they can administer and what works best. So very much so, some things are kind of experimental. Take a conservative approach and try something. If that doesn't work, try another thing. And I've found that working with those veterinarians has really been good, because there's been times when we maybe disagree on what course of action we should take. And although I'm not a veterinarian, I don't know much about medication, I heavily lean on them for that knowledge. But I'm the one observing the tortoise every day. I'm the one seeing, okay, this medication maybe worked, but one dose wasn't enough. We need to do it for 5 days. And thankfully, there's been times when they just went with it, and we kind of put our heads together and go with course of action, and it ends up working out really well. So I would say definitely the on the medical side has been a work in progress in learning that area. And especially on the parasitic side, super controversial even in the veterinary field, whether some parasites are commensal or if they're parasitic. So basically, should you treat or should you not treat? So I have the capability now of testing our own fecal samples here, but even if I find something, then you have to decide, do I treat it or do I not? Well, is the amount high or is the amount low? Well, that's even hard to tell, because a fecal sample is not a homogenized mixture. It's whatever certain sample you got. The amount, quantifying the pathogens or the organisms there is really difficult sometimes. So I'm just learning more about that and becoming kind of self-sufficient in that area as much as possible, at least, while using my veterinarian, developing a relationship with them has been super helpful and a work in progress here, but we're getting there.
Awesome. Well, there's a lot of learning in the reptile community, and constantly adapting is so huge for what we do, and I love what you are doing here, and it's super inspirational to see this happening in Iowa, where there's not a whole lot of tortoises, but there's a huge need for this sort of thing. Where can our viewers find more information about you and what you do?
Yeah, so you should be able to go to our website at bigandsmalltortoise.org. And then we also have a Facebook page that I update much more frequently. So feel free to either email me or message me on Facebook. That would be the best way to reach out.
Okay. Well, thank you for the interview, and we look forward to working with you in the future.